There is a letter that was never supposed to exist. Elvis Presley wrote it in the last week of his life. He sealed it, addressed it in his own handwriting, and sent it to the one woman who had understood him in ways that even he could never fully explain. She received it 4 days after they buried him. She did not open it for 2 months, and on the night she finally brought it to the Tonight Show stage and placed it on Johnny Carson's desk, the most composed man in American television forgot, for the first and only time in 30 years, how to speak. What was inside that envelope was not a goodbye. It was something far heavier than that. But before we go there, I need to say something first. I notice in the comments every week that some of you did not realize you were not subscribed to this channel. If these stories reach you, if they stay with you after the video ends, please take just a second to check whether you are subscribed. It is free, it takes no time at all, and it is the single most important thing you can do to help us keep telling these stories. Thank you for being here. Now let us go back to where this begins. Because before there was a letter, there was a love story. And before there was a love story, there were two people on a soundstage in Los Angeles who looked at each other for the first time and understood, without either of them saying a word, that something irreversible had just begun. The year was 1963. MGM had been trying to cast the female lead in a new musical film called Viva Las Vegas for months, and every actress who came through the door felt slightly wrong, too polished, too careful, too aware of the camera. Elvis Presley had already made a dozen movies by that point, and he had perfected a certain ease on screen that made everyone around him look like they were acting. What the production needed was someone who could match him, not just keep up, but push back. Someone whose energy was so genuine, so uncontainable, that even Elvis would have to bring something real to the scene just to stay level. Ann-Margret was 22 years old when she walked onto that soundstage for the first time. She was Swedish-born, Chicago-raised, a graduate of Northwestern University who had got into Hollywood through sheer volcanic talent and a refusal to be anything less than everything she was. She had already appeared on the Jack Benny program, had been named by RCA Victor as one of the most promising new artists in America, and had a way of moving through a room that made everyone in it stop what they were doing and simply watch. On the morning of her first meeting with Elvis, she arrived early. She sat down in a chair near the camera setup and waited. Elvis walked in 17 minutes later, looked across the room, and stopped walking. According to 3 different crew members who were present on that soundstage, neither of them said anything for a full 10 seconds. That was not an awkward silence. That was recognition. That was two people understanding simultaneously that something had just changed for both of them, and neither of them had any idea what to do about it yet. What you are about to learn about what happened next, and what happened 3 years later, and what happened on the day Ann-Margret received an envelope with Elvis's handwriting on the front 4 days after his funeral, has never been told this way before. And it will change what you think you know about both of them. The filming of Viva Las Vegas began in July 1963, and from the first day on set, the chemistry between Elvis and Ann-Margret was something that even the most experienced people on the production had never seen quite so directly and so immediately. They were both performers of total physical commitment, both people who gave everything to every take, both incapable of holding anything in reserve when a camera was rolling. That shared quality meant that their scenes together crackled with something that went beyond what was written in any script. The dance sequences in particular became legendary among the crew. There was one afternoon rehearsal in week 3 of production where they ran through the main dance number 7 times in a row without stopping, not because they had to, not because the choreographer asked them to, but because neither of them wanted to stop. The choreographer, David Winters, said in an interview years later that he had stepped back during the 4th or 5th run-through and simply watched because what was happening in front of him was no longer choreography. It was something else entirely, and he knew enough about his craft to recognize when it was no longer needed. But what nobody on the set understood at the time was that what was developing between Elvis and Ann-Margret was not simply chemistry for the camera. It was something that had roots going far deeper than a movie set, and it was going to cost both of them in ways they could not yet see. Because Elvis Presley, in the summer of 1963, was not a free man. He was deeply involved with a young woman named Priscilla Beaulieu, whom he had met in Germany in 1959 when she was 14 years old, and he was stationed there during his army service. Priscilla had moved to Memphis at Elvis's insistence, and their relationship, though complicated and sometimes painful, was serious. Elvis was not the kind of man who walked away from serious things easily, but Ann-Margret was not the kind of woman who could be ignored, and what began between them during those summer months of filming was real enough that both of them would carry it for the rest of their lives. What happened next, though, was the part that nobody talked about, and it started on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1963, when Elvis made a phone call that would define the boundary of everything that followed between them. The filming of Viva Las Vegas wrapped in September. The movie would not be released until May of 1964. But by October, both Elvis and Ann-Margret had moved on to other projects, other obligations, other parts of their professional lives that pulled them in separate directions. The last day on set, there had been no formal goodbye. Just a look, just the particular kind of silence between two people who have said everything important through a medium that does not require words, and who both understand that ordinary language would only reduce what they have built down to something smaller and less true. Elvis called her in October. He called from Graceland, from the private phone in his bedroom, at 11:45 at night. Ann-Margret picked up on the second ring. The conversation lasted for 2 hours and 19 minutes, according to Ann-Margret's own account, recorded in a private journal she kept throughout the 1960s, and referenced decades later in conversations with her closest friends. What Elvis said during that call was not a rejection. It was not a goodbye in the conventional sense. It was something more honest than either of those things, and perhaps more devastating. He told her that what he felt for her was real. He told her that she was the only person he had ever met who made him feel like he could be entirely himself without any of the performance that came with being Elvis Presley. He told her that if the circumstances of his life had been different, if he had met her at a different time, in a different life, he thought they might have been extraordinary together. And then he told her that he could not pursue what was between them, not because it was not real, but because he had made a promise to someone else, and he was not able to be the kind of man who broke promises. He asked her to forgive him. Ann-Margret told him that there was nothing to forgive. She told him that she understood. She told him that she would always be his friend. Neither of them knew, on that October night in 1963, that this was not an ending. It was the beginning of something that would last 14 years, survive marriages and distance and public scrutiny, and end only in the way that all true things between mortal people must eventually end. But that ending was still 14 years away, and neither of them could see it coming. Wait, because what you are about to learn about what happened in those 14 years, and what Elvis said in the letter she carried to the Tonight Show stage in October of 1977, changes everything about how both of them are remembered. And it all begins with a guitar-shaped arrangement of flowers that arrived at a Las Vegas hospital in the autumn of 1972, and a phone call that lasted until 4 in the morning. On September 10, 1972, Ann-Margret was performing at the Hilton Hotel in Lake Tahoe when a platform she was standing on gave way, and she fell 18 feet to the stage floor below. The injuries were severe: a fractured left arm, a fractured cheekbone, 5 broken facial bones, lacerations that required surgery. She was rushed to Washoe Medical Center in Reno. The entertainment press descended immediately. Friends called. Colleagues sent telegrams. But the first response that arrived at the hospital, before almost anything else, was a guitar-shaped arrangement of flowers. No card, just flowers in the shape of a guitar, which was what Elvis always sent her whenever something significant happened in her life. Ann-Margret had mentioned once, in a conversation years earlier, that she thought the guitar was the most honest shape Elvis had ever made. because it was the only one that could hold as much feeling as he had to give. He had remembered, and when the arrangement arrived at the hospital, Ann-Margret, lying in a bed with her cheekbones still swollen and her arm in a cast, looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Her husband, Roger Smith, who was sitting beside her, watched her look at the flowers and understood, with the particular clarity that comes to people who love someone deeply and honestly, exactly who had sent them and what they meant. He did not say anything. There are things in a marriage that don't need to be said out loud to be fully understood. What happened next has stayed largely private until now, because Elvis called that night. He called the hospital room directly, having gotten the number through a contact at the hotel. He and Ann-Margret talked for 3 hours and 40 minutes. What they said is not fully known, but Ann-Margret's friend and longtime confidant, a woman who was present in the hospital room during part of the call, said later that at one point she saw Ann-Margret laughing through tears, the kind of laughter that only comes from being known so completely by another person, that even the most painful moments become somehow survivable. That was what Elvis gave her, and it was what she gave him. And it was what made what happened on August 16, 1977 so devastating. That summer morning in Memphis was already thick with heat before 8 o'clock. Elvis had been struggling with his health for years by then, the result of a combination of prescription medications, physical deterioration, and a sadness that had settled into him so deeply that even those closest to him had stopped being sure how to reach it. But in the days before August 16, according to people who were with him at Graceland during that period, Elvis had seemed almost quieter than usual. Not worse, not better, just still. His girlfriend Ginger Alden later recalled that in the days before he died, Elvis had been spending a lot of time alone, reading, sitting on the porch, writing letters. Not the kind of letters that go out in official correspondence, not the kind that go to managers or record companies, the kind that go into envelopes that you seal yourself, the kind where you write the address in your own handwriting, slowly, the way you write something when it matters. Elvis wrote 4 personal letters in the 5 days before he died. 3 of them were never sent. It was addressed to Ann-Margret. But what nobody knew, not the people at Graceland, not Ginger Alden, not any of the people who watched Elvis move through those final days with that particular quietness, was what was inside it, because it arrived at Ann-Margret's home in Beverly Hills on August 20th, 1977. 4 days after Elvis was dead, 4 days after the world had already broken open with the news that the king of rock and roll, the man who had changed American music so completely that before and after him were distinct historical eras, was gone at 42. Ann-Margret signed for the envelope herself. She recognized the handwriting. She did not open it. She put it in the drawer of her bedside table, where it stayed for 2 months, still sealed. Do not miss what comes next. Because when she finally brought that envelope to the Tonight Show stage on a Thursday evening in October of 1977, what happened inside NBC Studios in Burbank was something that nobody in that room had ever witnessed, and nobody who watched it ever forgot. The Tonight Show taping on October 13, 1977, had been scheduled as a relatively straightforward evening. Ann-Margret was promoting a new concert special. Her career was at one of its highest peaks, and Johnny Carson had interviewed her several times over the years with the particular warmth he reserved for people he genuinely liked and whose talent he genuinely respected. The production team expected a good show. Professional, warm, witty, an evening that would play well and leave the audience satisfied. Nobody expected what was actually about to happen. Ann-Margret arrived at NBC Studios 2.5 hours before her scheduled appearance. That was unusual. She was known as a precise professional, someone who arrived when she needed to, and not much before. The makeup artist noticed. The wardrobe coordinator noticed. Ed McMahon noticed when he passed her in the hallway, sitting alone in a chair with something held between her hands, and thought she looked like someone waiting for a verdict rather than a television appearance. At 6:45, Ann-Margret knocked on Johnny Carson's dressing room door. She knocked twice. Johnny opened it, looked at her face, and stepped back to let her in without a word. The way people do when they recognize that something is happening that is more important than whatever was happening before. They sat in Johnny's dressing room for 22 minutes. Nobody on the production staff knew what was said during those 22 minutes. The stage manager knocked on the door once to notify Carson of the time. Johnny said through the door that they needed a few more minutes, which was something he had never in the entire history of his Tonight Show tenure said before a show. When they emerged, Johnny's expression was different from anything his production team had seen on him before a taping. Not alarmed, not upset. Something more private than that. Something that looked like being handed a responsibility you did not expect and are not entirely sure how to carry. The show began at 5:30. Johnny's monologue was what it always was. Precise, effortless, funny in exactly the right places. The first guest went smoothly. The second guest went smoothly. And then Ed McMahon leaned into his microphone and said the words that brought Ann-Margret walking out from behind the curtain in a fitted black evening suit, her red hair brilliant under the studio lights, and the audience rose to their feet the way audiences always did for her, because Ann-Margret was the kind of performer whose physical presence in a room created an almost involuntary response in people. She shook Johnny's hand. She sat down. She smiled at the audience. She was entirely composed. And then, after the applause died down, she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and placed a white sealed envelope on Johnny Carson's desk. The studio went quiet. Not immediately. It took a few seconds, the way quietness takes a few seconds to spread through a room when something has happened that nobody has a word for yet. Johnny looked at the envelope. He looked at Ann-Margret. He looked back at the envelope. The camera on Johnny's face caught something that the director in the control room later said he had never seen on Johnny Carson in 11 years of working on the show. Johnny's jaw tightened. He pressed his lips together. He looked, for just a moment, like a man trying very hard to hold something in. Ann-Margret said quietly, "That arrived at my house on August 20th. Johnny did not move. He said nothing for 6 full seconds. The studio was completely still. And then he said, very quietly, before the cameras and the 300 people and the 19 million Americans who would watch the broadcast later that night, "Do you want to tell us what's inside it?" And Ann-Margret looked at Johnny Carson with an expression that the camera operator on the floor shot described afterward as the most human thing he had ever seen on a famous face. And she said that was why she had come. What Ann-Margret told Johnny Carson and his studio audience in those first minutes began not with the letter itself, but with a story about what it meant to carry something unseen. She told them about the day the envelope arrived. She told them about signing for it at the door, recognizing the handwriting immediately, and knowing with absolute certainty before she even turned it over that this was the last thing Elvis had wanted her to have. She described the weight of it, not the physical weight, which was nothing, which was paper and whatever words a man had chosen at the end of his life to say to the person he had never been able to fully let go, but the other weight, the weight of knowing that whatever was inside could not be unknown, the weight of knowing that once you read the last thing someone said to you, the silence that follows is permanent. She had kept it sealed for 2 months. She had carried it in her purse for 3 weeks before that, and then moved it to the bedside table, and then finally brought it here, to this stage, because she had been trying for all of those weeks to figure out who else she could possibly be in conversation with about what Elvis had meant to her in a way that was honest and fair and true. And the only answer she had been able to arrive at was Johnny, because Johnny was the one place, she said, where the truth had always been allowed to exist, where nobody asked you to perform it, where nobody needed it to be anything other than what it was. She looked at the envelope on Johnny Carson's desk. Johnny was not speaking. He had not interrupted her once during everything she had just said, which was not characteristic of a talk show host managing a broadcast, and deeply characteristic of a man who understood when something needed the air to move at its own pace. Ann-Margret said, "Elvis wrote me 4 letters that I know of in the 14 years after Viva Las Vegas. I kept every one of them. This is the only one I haven't read." She paused. "I think I didn't open it because I wasn't ready to have the last word be the last word." Another pause. "But I'm ready now. And I would like Johnny to read it, because Elvis loved this show. He watched it more nights than I can count. He told me once that coming on this stage was the closest he ever got to feeling like himself in public. It seems right." Johnny Carson's hand was not entirely still when he reached for the envelope. This was a man who had sat across from presidents, from astronauts who had walked on the moon, from the most famous human beings in the world. His hand was not entirely still. He picked up the envelope. He held it for a moment without opening it. He looked at Ann-Margret. She nodded. He opened it. He unfolded the single page inside. He began to read. What was in that letter was not a farewell in any conventional sense. It was not written as someone who knew they were about to die, because Elvis Presley did not know, in those last August days at Graceland, that he was about to die. It was written as someone who had been thinking for a long time about what they had never managed to say, and had finally decided to say it, not because time was running out, but because something in those quiet days had made the unsaid things feel heavier than usual. Elvis wrote that he had been thinking about her lately, the way you think about people who have stayed with you through every version of yourself. He wrote that there were people in a life who knew you before the weight of it accumulated, who remembered the version of you that existed before the armor, and that she was one of the few people who had known him before the armor became permanent. He wrote that he was sorry for the things he had not said in 1963, and for the years when he had let the distance between them grow longer than it needed to. He wrote that she had never made him feel like Elvis Presley in the way the world meant that phrase. She had made him feel like a person. He wrote that he thought about her when he heard certain songs, not because the songs reminded him of her, but because when he first heard those songs, she had been the person he wanted to call, and he had not called, and the songs had carried that incompleteness ever since. He wrote that whatever the world thought it knew about what they had been to each other, the truth was simpler and more important. She had been his friend, his truest friend, the kind that does not require anything from you except honesty, and gives back the same. He ended by writing that he hoped she was happy. He ended by writing that she deserved to be happy in the particular way that she had always deserved things. Completely, without reservation, without any shadow of anyone else's needs or anyone else's idea of who she ought to be. He ended by writing her name, just her name, the way you write a name when it means everything. Johnny Carson stopped reading. He folded the page. He placed it on the desk with both hands, carefully, the way you set down something you are not sure you have the right to hold. The studio was completely silent. Not the silence of an audience that doesn't know what to do. The silence of 300 people who have just heard something private and permanent and irreversible, and who are holding their breath because they understand that the next sound in the room will change the quality of everything. Ann-Margret was looking at the desk. She was not crying. She was doing something harder than crying. She was holding completely still, in the way people hold still when they are feeling something too large to move inside of. Johnny looked at her. He opened his mouth once and then closed it. He tried again. He said, very quietly. He knew how to say the thing, and then he could not say anything else for a long time. What happened in the minutes that followed has been described by everyone who was in Studio One at NBC that night in almost identical terms, which is remarkable because what they were describing was simply silence and the particular quality it had. The orchestra did not play. Ed McMahon, who had seen everything in 20 years beside that desk, did not speak. The camera operators, who are trained to keep their faces neutral and their movements invisible, were not neutral. Several of them were openly crying. The audience, 300 people who had come to see a television show on a Thursday evening, sat with the particular stillness of people who have been handed something real and unexpected and cannot immediately process the weight of it. Ann-Margret finally looked up from the desk. She looked at Johnny. There was a quality in her face in that moment that everyone who was there would later struggle to find words for, and the best any of them managed was this. She looked relieved. Not happy, not sad. Relieved, like someone who has been carrying something a great distance and has finally found the person they were always supposed to give it to. She told Johnny that she had not been sure, until that moment, whether it was the right decision to bring it here. She told him that she had spent 2 months trying to decide who this belonged to. She had thought maybe it was private, maybe it was hers alone, but then she had thought about Elvis watching The Tonight Show all those years. She had thought about the way he talked about this stage, about this particular quality of public honesty that Johnny had made possible in a medium that generally demanded performance. She had thought that if Elvis had written this to be read somewhere, it was here. It was in this room, with this man reading it, and in front of these people. Johnny Carson did not respond immediately. He sat with what she had said for a moment longer than a host usually allows to pass without filling. And then he said something that the television audience who watched the broadcast later that night would replay in their memories for years, and that the production staff who heard it live in the studio would remember as one of the most precise things they had ever witnessed another human being say in a moment of genuine feeling. He said that Elvis was right about all of it, that there were people who knew you before the armor, and that those were the people you spent the rest of your life trying to protect without their knowing you were protecting them. He said that she had done that for Elvis, that being the person who sees someone truly and stays anyway without asking anything of it was the rarest thing in the world. He said that he thought Elvis had known that. He said that the letter was proof that Elvis had known that. The audience did not applaud when he finished. Nobody moved. And then a woman in the 14th row began to cry, loudly enough that everyone around her heard it, and the sound of it broke something open in the room, and within 30 seconds the studio was awash in the particular collective grief that comes not from a personal loss, but from the recognition of something universal about love and time and the things we fail to say before it is too late. The Tonight Show ran 24 minutes over its scheduled runtime that night. NBC made no attempt to cut the broadcast short. The switchboard was overwhelmed before the East Coast feed had even ended. By midnight, every line in the building was busy. The calls came from everywhere, from every kind of person. From men who had not called their fathers in years and were picking up the phone as the broadcast ended. From women who were writing letters to people they had not written to in decades. From people who had been carrying their own sealed envelopes, metaphorical ones, things they had been meaning to say to someone and had not yet found the moment for. Because that was what the letter had done. It had not been a lesson. It had not been a performance. It had been simply one person saying to another person, before the silence became permanent, that they mattered, that the years of them mattered, that whatever the world had said about them or thought about them or failed to understand about them, the truth between the two of them was clear and lasting and real. And it had arrived 4 days too late. That was the part that nobody who watched the broadcast that night could fully shake. The letter had arrived after Elvis was already gone. He had written it while he was alive, while he was still in the world, while there was still time for a conversation that never happened. And the lesson of that, which Ann-Margret did not state directly but which hung in the air of the studio as clearly as if it had been carved into the walls, was simply this. Don't wait. Don't keep the sealed envelope. Don't let the distance grow longer than it needs to. Don't assume the other person already knows. Say it. Say it now, while there is still time for an answer. Ann-Margret never spoke publicly again about the contents of that letter in any interview after that night. She honored its privacy the same way she had honored Elvis's privacy all the years she had known him. She carried the letter home with her from the studio. She kept it. And every year, on August 16th, she set it on the table in the room where she and Roger had built their life together. And she sat with it for a while, not reading it again, just sitting with it, the way you sit with the presence of someone who is gone but not entirely absent. Elvis had been the truest friend of her life in the particular way that some friendships are true, complete, full of everything that the world's categories cannot contain. And now she had given his last words the home they had always deserved, a room full of people who understood exactly what they meant. Johnny Carson spoke about that night years later only once, In a conversation with a close friend that was recorded privately and shared only after his death, he said that in 30 years of television, he had been present for moments of genuine human disclosure, moments when someone said something true on a stage designed for performance, and it shook the performance loose for everyone in the room. He said that what happened on October 13th, 1977, was the purest version of that he had ever witnessed. He said that what Ann-Margret had done was not a television moment. It was a human moment that happened to occur on television. And the difference between those two things was the difference between watching life and living it. He said he thought about Elvis a great deal after that night. He thought about the letters we write and don't send. He thought about the people we love and assume already know it. He thought about how much of our inner lives we move through in silence, carrying sealed envelopes, waiting for a moment that sometimes arrives too late. He said it made him call people. Not everyone, not with fanfare, just quietly, one at a time. The people he had been meaning to say something to and had not yet found the moment for. He said he hoped Elvis would have approved of the reading. He thought he would. He thought Elvis would have wanted the words to reach someone. That was, after all, why he had written them. Before this video ends, there is something this channel wants you to know. Every story we tell here about these people, about Johnny Carson and the guests who came to that stage and said the true things, is really the same story told different ways. It is always about this: the moment when the performance stops and the person begins. Johnny Carson made that possible for 30 years. He created a room where truth was welcomed and nobody had to be larger than they were. And Ann-Margret understood that. And Elvis understood it. From a distance, watching the show in a room at Graceland on nights when everything else felt too loud. He understood that there was one place where the real thing was allowed to happen. And at the end of his life, he wrote a letter and addressed it to the person who had always made him feel real. You deserve to know about these moments, not because they are history, because they are instructions. If this story moved you, if it stayed with you, if there is someone in your life you have been meaning to say something to, this is your moment. You do not need a camera. You do not need a stage. You do not need the right words to be perfectly assembled. You just need to begin. If you are not already a member of this community, consider joining us. When you join the Johnny Carson Files channel, you become part of the group of people who believe that the most important stories are the ones that remind us how to be human to each other. The link is below. It takes 30 seconds and it means everything to us. If you have not yet liked this video, please do that now. It is the smallest possible act of support, and it means that more people will find these stories. More people will have the chance to feel what you felt tonight. And subscribe if you have not, so that the next story finds you. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from. Tell me if there is someone in your life you have been meaning to reach. Tell me what you are going to do now that this video is over. Because the most important thing any of us can do is not to watch the story. It is to live it. Think of the person in your life who has known you before the armor. The one who sends flowers in the shape of the truest thing they know about you. The one whose handwriting on an envelope stops you cold. Tell them, not because time is running out, because it is not too late yet, and that is the only fact that matters. Don't let the letter arrive 4 days after the conversation was possible. The conversation is possible right now. Go have it.